His book, Spacesuit, Fashioning Apollo, examines a small piece of the space program, namely the spacesuit itself as an allegory to our relationship to atmosphere, the human body, and of course, architecture. It's an extremely well-researched book and one that I urge all of you to get a copy of. It's in its third printing after 1 year, by the way, which is pretty amazing for architectural publications. If you were born before about 1964, chances are you have a personal memory of the first landing on the moon on July 20th, 1969. I was 6 years old, and we huddled around a black and white television as Walter Cronkite and CBS Channel 2 out of New York guided us through the grainy images. And I was as excited to be able to stay up until 11 o'clock in the evening as anything else. I, for one, have been hooked on NASA and the space program and a kind of junkie ever since. In the wake of Kennedy's challenge to the nation to land on the moon before the end of the 1960s, the space program has held a definitive position in our culture. The technologies born from this endeavor are well known and are wide and broad, including everything from memory foam to mylar to heart pumps and solar cells. The first images shown of the Earth by the earlier orbiters, and then later the famous photograph of the Earth from the moon itself, have been equated with launching a new understanding of the Earth as object and arguably the inspiration of a multitude of environmental movements. But tonight, Nicholas will take us on a journey of a much more focused look into the early years of NASA and the spacesuit. And I'm sure he'll tell us along the way his observations on the relevance of this part of history as it pertains to his work as an architect. One might ask, what does fashion, military research, cyborgs, 21 layers, and Playtex bras and girdles have to do with architecture? Nicholas de Monchaux is here to tell us. Please join me in welcoming Nicholas.
Hi, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I'm going to start with this lecture mixes history and ideas and architecture. And I'll start with the first character in the lecture, who is myself. I have a particular memory of SCI-Arc, even though I have never actually been to SCI-Arc before tonight. Had a particularly instrumental role or a pivotal role in the sense of an actual historical pivot in my own architectural education, which is that I was an undergraduate at Yale, which is generally a great place to be an undergraduate, of course, but the architecture program has the undergraduate architecture program has the quality that the studio instructors for undergraduate studios are selected by dint of no graduate student having selected them for the option studios. So had two results. One, I had an entirely postmodern undergraduate architectural education in the mid to late 90s. And secondly, there were a couple of studios that weren't very good. And we didn't really realize this, of course, because we weren't even in the same building as the graduate students at the time, until a SCI-Arc student publication, undergraduate student publication, somehow landed in our studio. And we had two reactions. One was, A, this is what we signed up for, and B, this is not what we're getting. So it led to a kind of an organization on the part of the undergraduate architecture students at Yale, which had some effect on our undergraduate education, and has left me with an abiding appreciation for this place that I've never been before. So thanks very much, John, and everyone else for the invitation. Now, on the theme of personal history, when I was a graduate student, I sat through many lectures that went something like this. It was the heyday of a kind of critical theoretical approach to architecture, just pre-digital, and the lecture went something along the lines of, here's several theories, mostly by French people, and then a bunch of architecture projects to follow, which can only be understood, accessed, or justified through an understanding of this theory. Now, today, of course, as this enormous shift in architectural media, which I'll try and address in the larger content of the lecture, has led to a profusion of projects and visual images, and a kind of strange absence of this ghost of theory. Today's lecture mostly looks something like this, or at least it does the ones I go to, an abundance of visual material and projects, and not necessarily a lot of underlying ideas. Now, right now, tonight, I'm going to actually try something I've never done before, which is to say I have this project. I can't even say it was as useful as anything like a PhD, but this project of understanding the Apollo spacesuit, which took me about a decade to really get going. And then, of course, I've had a parallel career as a designer and an architect working in some of the same themes of technology, new media, and the city that I'll talk about in the context of the spacesuit. So I'm not going to burden you with too much of my own design work, because I know you came here to learn about spacesuits, but I am going to try and make a transition, and the basic structure is this one, which is to say I'm going to introduce you to 18 characters, actually 17, because I've just introduced you to the first character, which is myself, and we're going to go through them from the infinite to the intimate, and from the kind of space that we talk about in the context of the space race to the kind of space that we talk about as architects. Let's get going. Second character is John F. Kennedy, who would actually change his shirt up to 5 times a day and change his entire wardrobe from skin to surface about twice a day, assisted by his valet, because of course his body was enormously sick, a fact which he managed to hide for his entire administration. Partially as a result, I would argue, he was a master of that vast distance that separates image and reality, a distance, I might add, regularly traveled by those in this room. In 1961, after Yuri Gagarin's dramatic orbit of the Earth and the globe's saturation in its surrounding imagery, it was Kennedy who sought the image of an American on the moon as the ultimate Cold War weapon. Do we have a chance of beating the Soviets by a space program which promises dramatic results? Kennedy demanded of Lyndon Johnson, titular head of American space efforts, 8 days after Gagarin's flight. 2 weeks later, at a meeting of the Departments of Defense, State, NASA, and the President's office, it was agreed that a lunar landing was the goal likely to have, quote, the clearest impact on the global imagination. As a result, by 1968, Apollo's budget swept up almost a nickel from every tax dollar, employed 500,000 people through a complex infrastructure of contractors and consultants throughout 46 states. It was a vast architecture, though, much as other architectures have been since dedicated to the production of a single image, that of a television, that is a television image of an American on the surface of the moon. A literal tracing of the architectural impact of this effort would follow every gunmetal desk, every hung paneled ceiling, every memorandum holder that traveled through this vast architecture. But of course, by mid-century, architecture was already an enterprise of image creation itself. By that measure, that is to say, if we attempt to understand the difference between the image and the reality of the space race, we end up with, I will argue to you tonight, a story of the architect in space, or that is to say, of architecture and space, the space around us now, which is the conventional space of the architect, and infinite space, outer space, this very new kind of space we were introduced to in mid-century. These two kinds of space together actually allow us also to negotiate some of the issues that we are dealing with very urgently now in the profession, which is to say a relationship to technology, a relationship to nature, and a shifting relationship to the media of architectural production. But to really understand this issue of space, we actually have to go back a little bit further. The first person to use the word space in the sense of outer space was actually Satan, or that is to say more properly, John Milton putting words in the mouth of Satan, when Satan described the space between worlds, occupied only by angels, and then later, of course, in the narrative, by demons. Now, the result of this idea of space that is to say, the space between worlds occupied by divine beings, gives a very interesting definition to space. The actual physical definition of space is enormously different depending on who you are. If you're a rocket engineer, space is about 250,000 feet above the Earth. If you're an astronomer, it's about 5 million feet of altitude above the Earth. If you're an aeronautical engineer, it's about 100,000 feet. And if you're a doctor, a physician of the human body, it's about 37,000 feet, lower than the summit of Everest. Now, the common sense that all these definitions have is that for each of these disciplines, space is defined as the environment which we need technology in order to enter. That is to say, without technology, without the rocket or the airplane or the breathing apparatus, we cannot enter this realm. This realm is otherwise barred to us, but in entering it through technology, we attain at least a spark of the divine. That is to say, we come to have the character of these mystical beings who had heretofore been the only ones occupying the space between worlds. Now, in the international architectural literature of the late 1960s, there's a particular fascination with this idea of the transformed man as spaceman. Or that is to say, in the architectural literature outside of the United States, especially, for example, in the United Kingdom, we have artifacts like this February 1967 issue of Architectural Design, edited by Buckminster Fuller disciple John McHale, containing essays like Man Plus, in which the idea of the astronaut as kind of a hero is maintained, someone who literally incorporates architecture into himself, making more traditional architectures redundant and somehow attaining a kind of new liberation. In American publications, however, interestingly enough, we don't find a single astronaut or any images of this vast and interesting architecture that was developing around the space race, from Cape Kennedy to the actual architecture of space capsules themselves. Rather, there's a fascination in American literature not with the ends of the process of building for the space race, but rather with the means. That is to say, the prospects in architecture for what at the time was called systems engineering. Fourth character is Christian Dior. In 1947, Christian Dior introduced a collection called initially the Tulip line of dresses, but that was named by Harper's Bazaar editor Carmel Snow the New Look. The New Look was notable in many regards. First of all, it was vastly different from the restrained, rationed architecture of wartime dresses in fashion. Each New Look dress contained up to 60 yards of fabric. And second of all, the phrase New Look, this New Look that was so revolutionary in fashion, came to stand for all manner of transformations that were taking place in the post-war United States and therefore, of course, in the post-war world as a whole. Fifth character, Dwight Eisenhower. Some 6 years after Christian Dior's collection, in December 1953, Admiral Arthur Radford, who was the chairman of Eisenhower's chief of staff, gave a speech to the National Press Club entitled "The New Look in Defense Planning." Now, this was an example of one of many examples of the use of the phrase "new look" to define something fundamentally new, but this New Look stuck, and you can still find academic papers on Eisenhower's New Look, which was not, of course, anything to do with Dior, but rather to do with the fundamental decision Eisenhower made after the morass of Korea, which is to say, instead of devoting American defense resources to an enormous standing army of the type that had been bogged down on the Korean peninsula for several years by the time Eisenhower took office, rather, Eisenhower, as explained by Radford in the speech, devoted instead a smaller but still enormous amount to research and development, especially surrounding the architecture that delivered the latest and most technologically sophisticated in the American arsenal, the nuclear bomb. Now, Nuclear bombs, by the time of Eisenhower's administration, were already a settled artifact. That is to say, the first hydrogen bomb, shown here, was exploded very early in the 1950s. And 50 of them could easily destroy the industrial capacity of the Soviet Union. However, the process of delivering these weapons to their targets was not settled at all. Admiral Curtis LeMay, famous from a million late-night satires, advocated bombers, but increasingly the call in political circles and in the circles of the military itself was for a different kind of object. Actually, not an object at all. The intercontinental ballistic missile, fascinatingly enough, was the very first artifact that we can turn to in popular American culture that was called a system. Of course, when a publication explaining the Atlas missile development system to the Joint Chiefs of Staff was produced in 1953, the word system had to be explained in several paragraphs because it was so uncommon in common English usage. There was a few examples given, like the solar system or the Grand Central Railroad system, but it was not a word that had entered popular language at all. But it had to enter to describe this particular new kind of artifact that was being produced in and around the space race. Now, the first attempts to produce an intercontinental ballistic missile by the company Convair that had been contracted to produce them were colossal but very interesting failures. And what started to happen as the Atlas missiles produced by Convair were produced in the early 1950s was that unexpected and insidious relationships between all the different components of the missiles plagued an entire series of launches. For example, the resonant frequency of the gyroscope in the missile's tip was the same as the frequency produced by the turbofan injecting rocket fuel at high pressure into the engine at the bottom, resulting in the gyroscope failing and the missile exploding, etc., etc. Character 5, Bernard Shriver. What was developed instead of this traditional military engineering process was something entirely new, and it was actually done very close to this room where we're standing in Inglewood at the Western Development Division of the Air Force, as it was called, who took over ICBM development from Convair in the mid-1950s under the command of Lieutenant Colonel at the time, Bernard Shriver. Shriver had originally been trained as an architect, but the Depression had forced him into the Air Force. But he brought his design abilities to bear in collaboration with Simon Ramo and Dean Wooldridge, then at Hughes Aircraft, later forming the defense giant TRW, in order to create a new kind of process for the making of things. The things produced were not objects, they were systems. And the process, systems engineering, broke down all the components of a complex industrial artifact like the ICBM into a series of what were called black boxes, whose inputs and outputs and relationships were defined, but whose inner workings could be modified by the teams responsible for their manufacture. This system, a system for the production of systems, had two very interesting effects, which we're still feeling today, even in this profession. The first is that it broke down the production of something into not a single moment of creation, as had been the case in history beforehand, but rather a continuous process of making. Further, this continuous process of making and the continual process of improvement in the performance of all these components led to one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century, that is to say the arms race, which bankrupted the Soviet Union, but also very nearly bankrupted this country, as we sought constantly to improve and expand the performance of our weapon systems. It had a third effect too. It created a network of military organizations, commercial companies, and academic collaborators that produced something which scared Dwight Eisenhower, the author of this new look, so much that he devoted the text of his farewell address to it. That is to say, the military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower originally had intended to call the military-industrial academic complex until his speechwriters told him that was too clunky. Characters 5 and 6, Nathan Klein and Manfred Clynes. Now, if we leave the present again and go back to mid-century, especially at the dawn of the space age in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the process of systems engineering and its intersection theoretically and philosophically with the new field of cybernetics, an attempt to explain and define systems common to both natural and man-made systems, had a fascinating effect. None has entered our popular culture more strongly than the phrase coined by these two fellows. On the left, Nathan S. Klein, and on the right, Manfred Clynes. Klein was a noted psychiatrist. He had discovered the first antidepressant and the first MAOI inhibitor and the first antipsychotic drug, reserpine, used in the United States. He had single-handedly brought down the population of the Rockland State Hospital in Orange County, New York, from 100,000 interned psychiatric patients to less than 1,000 with the use of new drug techniques. In the late 1950s, he hired an analog computing researcher, Manfred Clynes, to perform research into cybernetic approaches to psychiatry. And when the two were asked by the Air Force to comment on the developing Air Force space program, they coined a new phrase, cybernetic organism, or as they shortened it, cyborg. The cyborg was the solution they proposed to how man might occupy space, an environment fundamentally hostile to his own being. The idea was widely published. This is a spread from Life magazine, and it fundamentally sought, through the lens of cybernetics, to apply the process of systems engineering, that is to say, the modification of relationships between a set of black boxes, to the human body itself. Here, the parts of the human body which are fragile under conditions of weightlessness and a vacuum, like the heart, lungs, liver, kidneys, are replaced by mechanical substitutes. The skin is replaced by a tight metallic mesh, and even the lenses of the eye are replaced by cameras, etc. It was also serious business. The United Aircraft Corporation launched into a large study of the cyborg concept and its potential development for astronautics, which did in the end conclude that it was a slightly more complex thing than maybe wanted to be taken on at the time, but it is indicative in its kind of presumptions about the human body and the human body's susceptibility to systematic analysis of the kind of research that was going on all around the military-industrial complex to prepare man for space. This research involved fundamentally quantifying and understanding the precise limits of human tolerance for things like acceleration and g-forces, and also the precise geometries of the body themselves. Here, a study on lines of non-extension across the torso by the RAND Corporation here in Los Angeles, and applying the lens of systems engineering to understand how the body might come to interface with precisely these large rockets, or ICBMs, that had been developed originally for nuclear weapons. Our seventh character, Charles Thornton, known as Tex. Charles Thornton was enterprising is an understatement, a kind of hardscrabble West Texas lad who found his way to Washington during the Depression and into the growth industry of the federal government at the time. During the Second World War, he founded the Office of Statistical Analysis, where he would become the mentor of Robert McNamara, who revolutionized the systems design of Army Air Force supply chains during the Second World War. In the post-war era, he had engineered the wholesale purchase of his team at the Air Force by the Ford Motor Company, but he clashed publicly with Henry Ford and left and went to work for Hughes, and then bought a small vacuum tube manufacturer, Litton Industries, here in Beverly Hills, which he transformed into the 20th century's largest conglomerate corporation. Amongst other things, it was very interested in the manufacture of spacesuits, and the hard, one-piece spacesuit prototypes made by Litton Industries were considered so promising for the prospect of use on the moon and use by American astronauts in outer space that they were assigned the designation RX by NASA's Crew Systems Division, representing, as they thought at the time, the prescription for mankind in space. A 1964 press release by NASA contrasted the Litton spacesuit with a conventionally, heroically masculine suit of armor and asked, quote, "Nothing new under ye old sun." And the kind of the Schlemmer-esque movements of the spacesuit under testing become a lot more comprehensible when you understand that William Elkins, the guy actually in this suit, was a student of protégés of Schlemmer's at the Chicago Bauhaus before he entered the Air Force. The RX suit broke down all the astronaut body types into a set of hard, perfectly matching prototype components, and while they never went into space, were still considered so representative of a certain heroic image of Americans in outer space that they formed the last diorama at the Osaka World's Fair in 1970, devoted to the American space race, even though they had long since been abandoned by NASA under the strains of Apollo. Our eighth character, Vykukal, was hailed by Michael Sorkin as one of the great design geniuses, unsung design geniuses of the 20th century. And the suit on the right here, the AX3, developed at the Ames Research Center, hailed as, again by Sorkin, quote, "one of the most beautiful design objects ever made." While these experimental suits were never actually intended for use in outer space, they again were the highly valued by NASA, and their work on individual joints and the kind of amazing elliptical stovepipe joints that allow a remarkable range of movement in these hard capsules were found their way quickly to many NASA and commercial prototypes. Character 9, Jay Forrester. If we are really to understand the space of the space race, we can think about the actual Miltonian sense of outer space, and we can think of conventional architectural space here on Earth, which of course the organizations of the space race also occupied. But we actually have to think about two new kinds of spaces made from whole cloth in the context of the military-industrial space race that astronauts were amongst the first to occupy, but which have formed an enormously ubiquitous part of our life to this day. In some ways, the author of both of these spaces was Jay Forrester, who, as an enterprising young employee of the Navy's computer operations, sold a venture on behalf of his own alma mater, MIT, to the Navy, which was initially, at least, devoted to something that looked like this. That is to say, a mechanical plane simulator. This project, called Whirlwind by Forrester, sought to replace the heavy analog aircraft simulators of the day, like this Link trainer, which used a kind of a system borrowed from organ pipes of tubes and pneumatic actuators to simulate the performance of a single aircraft. Like a violin or an organ, it had to be retuned to simulate the performance of a second or third aircraft. And it could only simulate the performance of aircraft that already existed, because the actual mechanisms of the aircraft's performance were only determined by measurement in flight and then translated into the actual architecture of the simulator. With the vast increase in flight operations in the Second World War, Forrester sold to the Navy the idea of a simulator using, at the time, analog computing, which could be switched from one plane type to another. And dangling out this very desirable promise to the Navy, he also potentially imagined a simulator which could simulate the performance of aircraft which had been designed but not yet even built. This was an entirely new idea. Forrester got over $20 million 1940s dollars from the Navy to do this and produced nothing. Or actually, a very special kind of something, but nothing that had anything to do with what he had asked to do. Quickly abandoning analog computing for the less well-known at the time province of digital computing, Forrester produced a system still called Whirlwind, after the name of the original simulator, but that did something very different from the airplane simulator it had originally been designed to produce. Amongst other things, to produce this artifact, Forrester invented magnetic core memory, and he also invented much of the systems architecture that we now that we now treat as ubiquitous in the world of computing. Because Whirlwind was, of course, the first real-time digital computer. That is to say, the first computer that had, instead of a system of punch cards that that could produce calculations serially and only in a kind of what was called a batch process for the literal batch of cards that went through. Whirlwind was the first computer that could respond in real time to user inputs. What he had convinced the new Air Force to do with it was produce a vast systems architecture of aerial defense. Called SAGE, the Semi-Autonomous Ground Environment, in which Whirlwind computers and SAGE consoles were stationed around the country, and they controlled the firing of ground-to-air missiles against a perceived Russian bomber attack. This, not incidentally, was also the very first computer interface, that is to say, the very first surface across which a human being interacted with a technological world. And it was an object deemed or intended to be so symbiotic in the very deepest cybernetic sense with its operator that, for example, it contained just on the left there, underneath this fellow's hand, a automotive cigarette lighter and ashtray, so that the operator would never actually have to leave the console. No one has experienced this kind of thing in a studio, I'm sure. Now, we'll see later on in this lecture, SAGE was also responsible for producing something else we take for granted today. That is to say, a digital representation of mapped space. This is the control room of the SAGE installation at Hampstead Field. Of course, SAGE was actually quickly canceled because they quickly, after the invention of the ICBM, it didn't make sense to be on the lookout for Russian bombers. But it produced this, this is the very first digital map representation of, in this case, the Massachusetts coastline, leading to the fundamental architecture of today's GIS and even some CAD software. If we go back to the original idea of simulation 2, it produced another kind, at least two other very tangible kinds of space-age architectures. The first, derived from the SAGE control room itself, was the architecture of the control room. That is to say, the space of information, a new kind of space by which a new kind of organization, this vast defense system, could assess and apportion resources in defense of the country. Here is the very first control room of the North American Air Command. In this case, analog displays are updated via telex signals, and television cameras then transmit these signals to other control spaces around the country. This control room, however, quickly morphed into a space of action in which actual commanders and lieutenants sat on the floor. And it's very easy to recognize in this architecture then the architecture that was developed for NASA itself of mission control here in its first rendering, in which a series of screens and a kind of cinematic panorama of screens at the front of the room are used to initiate and control a systems architecture, which in this case spanned 250,000 miles from a swamp in Houston to the surface of the moon. What's also very interesting about these architectures is that they are internal, but not external. That is to say, they are a brain without a face. Here's the outside of the mission control building. No prizes for guessing where the actual room is. But the other really interesting thing about the architecture of mission control, it was actually a very promiscuous architecture. That is to say, this mission control room, which we've all seen, you may not be aware that the room you have seen is actually one of two identical rooms stacked one on top of the other in this space. One of them is now mothballed to allow the kind of rapid simulation of missions in the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs, or that is to say, to allow the simulation of missions to continue at the same time as actual missions were being controlled in the room that was live and actually connected. But of course, the other really interesting thing about these virtual environments is that it was at the time it was remarked upon that it was impossible to tell for an uneducated observer which of the two twinned mission control rooms was actually being used to command, say, an Apollo mission on the surface of the moon, and which was being used to control a simulation here on Earth. It was not actually a twinned room, but it was even a triplet. This is the framework for the duplicate of mission control that was built to be the final and most well-known NORAD mission control room deep inside Cheyenne Mountain, made famous by one of my favorite movies of all time, War Games, which is a kind of quintessentially internal architecture. I always think it really looks like the Farnsworth house entombed, and is a really interesting kind of provocation about how much the ideas that we know in architecture through the lens of modernism were also part of the ghost of this particular but much less well-known history, a history which, as I hope I should make clear to you, I'm arguing tonight is much more influential on contemporary architectural practice than what we might understand to be a kind of traditional history of architectural modernism. The last literal architecture that Jay Forrester produced through his Whirlwind project were actually simulators. He didn't produce a simulator, but the techniques of digital simulation made possible by real-time computing allowed the necessary training of astronauts in simulators, which were initially analog but quickly moved to being digital. For the Mercury missions, these first of the kind of three rapid succession programs of the space race, astronauts spent maybe a few hundred hours in mostly analog simulators like this one. The Gemini simulators had several hundred hours worth of training for each astronaut and had sophisticated analog three-dimensional graphics produced by complex systems of lenses and tiny models that were magnified. But by the time of Apollo, the systems architecture of simulation had grown enormous. Not just in space, this is the two main simulators used. That's the, if you can see in here, that's a tiny, the comparatively tiny actual mock-up of the command module inside all of this architecture of virtual simulation, and that's the tiny lunar module back there. So this amazing kind of systems architecture of virtual environments was produced, and by the time of the Apollo landings, each Apollo astronaut had spent more than 3,500 hours in these simulators. Of course, fundamentally it was all about the fact that you could not land on the moon before you landed on the moon, and therefore, fundamentally, this architecture of simulation was essential. The last thing it gave us, and the thing that I'm guessing some of you were looking at all afternoon in studio before you came here, was the digital simulation of three-dimensional environments. The model, the kind of analog model approach could not be easily switched as landing sites shifted in priority or as the process, say, of landing on unexpected sites on the moon had to be simulated. So what was instead produced by General Electric was the very first three-dimensional virtual display. Each of these tubes was piped into a different window of the lunar lander simulator. And although the language is enormously encoded to our eyes, the system could only render 256 edges. It represented and it coded for an actual architecture of craters and mountains, et cetera, that the astronauts quickly learned and were able to negotiate. Our 10th character, Hubert Humphrey. In remarks at the Smithsonian in 1968, Vice President Hubert Humphrey declared, quote, "The techniques that are going to put a man on the moon are going to be exactly the techniques that we are going to need to clean up our cities." Humphrey pointed especially to what he called the systems analysis approach. Now, 40 years later, we're used to the comparison of putting a man on the moon as an expression of difficulty. If we can put a man on the moon, surely we can get cell phone reception in Manhattan. But at the time, this was not what Humphreys was saying. What he was actually saying was something quite different and much more interesting, which is to say that the techniques, the literal techniques of the space race, were going to become a panacea for what was seen to be the equally enormous problem facing American society at the time, that is to say, the problem of the city. I've got some slides out of order. This is our next character, Howard Finger. Howard Finger is interesting in this story for many reasons. First of all, for any fan of sci-fi, he was, in his role as Director of Nuclear Propulsion Research for NASA from the inception of NASA until 1968, he was responsible for, amongst other things, designing this spacecraft, a nuclear-powered ship designed for deep space exploration, which was used as the literal model for the spaceship Discovery by Stanley Kubrick when he hired a bunch of NASA people who were by 1968 out of a job in order to produce the graphics for his film 2001. But Finger was is most interesting in our narrative because by 1969, he had been hired by George Romney, Mitt Romney's father, as the first director of research and technology for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, where he funded at vast expense something called Operation Breakthrough, which you may never have heard of, but at the time was enormously influential on the practice of architecture. What Operation Breakthrough sought to do was apply the techniques of building from aerospace, prefabrication, new materials, et cetera, through what was first termed at the time a parametric model to create a series of urban neighborhoods throughout the country in which these prefabricated systems were parametrically adapted to local conditions through the use of mainframes trundled literally down Constitution Avenue from NASA's basement to the basements of the new Marcel Breuer HUD building. The context for this was a much deeper engagement between NASA and HUD and the Department of Transportation and urban government in the late 1960s and early 1970s, which led to, amongst other things, this publication, Science in the City, coming out of a joint NASA-HUD research system in which the report acknowledged, for example, quote, that creating a safe, happy city is a greater challenge than a trip to the moon because urban housing is more complex than a rocket and the city is subject to more perturbations than the moon. But, the report offered, its ever-changing problems can nevertheless be attacked in the same logical way we have gone about exploring the universe. Even Jay Forrester, for example, the founder of modern real-time computing, and was by 1968 publishing books like this one on cybernetic analysis of urban dynamics. And here in Los Angeles, the UCLA architecture faculty was using the GE Lunar Landing Simulator to produce this, the very first architectural rendering, digital architectural rendering of a modernist proposal for downtown Los Angeles, produced using only 256 edges, but 256 edges which it turned out were particularly amenable to the modeling of high-rise blocks, raised highways, and piloti. Now, while at the time, the promise of a translation from NASA to the problem of the city seemed immense, and in fact, there were summer schools all throughout the 1969, 1970, 1971 at Berkeley and MIT, training the NASA engineers who were out of a job with the defunding of space exploration after the achievement of Kennedy's goal to urban government, leading to the Community Analysis Bureau here in Los Angeles, which was active from the late 60s into the 80s. Believe it or not. But the actual impact of these programs was relatively small. In fact, Operation Breakthrough, the program authored by Howard Finger, was cited by the General Accounting Office as being one of the most enormous wastes of money it had ever seen. In fact, with quote-unquote no impact on the American architectural profession whatsoever. But a particularly interesting coda is provided by a 1975 study by NASA's Ames Research Center for a 10,000-person community built at Lagrange Point 3 in between the Earth and the Moon, in which the housing systems developed for Operation Breakthrough were deemed to be particularly appropriate for building in space. The program would, the city in space would house 10,000 astronauts, quote, optimized by age and gender, and settled by persons from Western industrialized nations. In the renderings accompanying the proposals, the components of systems buildings are seen in perhaps their only native soil, a perfectly managed, balanced world entirely subject to, quote, principles from government and industry. In this, of course, we see shades of parallel phenomena in architectural culture, the reduction or extension of architecture to an automatic, infinite response to the environment, either internal or external to the subject. An architecture everywhere and nowhere, much like the architecture of systems and networks itself. The liberation espoused especially by someone like Manfred Klein's, the cyborg, in the cyborg ideal, quote, he says, imagine what leaps a ballet dancer could do on the moon, is explicitly a kind of notion of mankind liberated from conventional notions of housing, fashion, and architecture by the network ideal. Equally, the computed city of the new urban frontier was, once realized, a perfect cyborg-like model that would presumably be free of the burdens of planning and the chief bugbear of uncertainty and decay. But the truth is, as always, much more interesting. When Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stood on the surface of the moon in July of 1969, they were not technologically modified cyborgs. They were not even wearing the hard one-piece suit so beloved of NASA systems engineered. Rather, the suit they were wearing was made, John gave this away already, by the Playtex Bra and Girdle Company. Without foundations, Dior had declared, referring to the way in which his restrictive fashions demanded the use of a underwear girdle, there can be no fashion. The International Latex Company, which was known mostly then by its consumer brand Playtex, was the nation's largest manufacturer of girdles, in particular rubber latex girdles, which were as ubiquitous in the late 1940s and early 1950s as they are, probably thankfully, disappeared today. The company had been founded by a self-educated immigrant, Abram Spinell, and its chief development engineer, later the chief engineer of the Apollo spacesuit program, was a guy named Len Shepard, who had no larger qualification than he had been Spinell's favored television repairman. Which brings us to our 13th and 14th characters, sewers and Hardknocksers. The word seamstress was deemed even too grand for Playtex. Women who worked the assembly line, whether they made bras, girdles, or Apollo spacesuits, were known as sewers. Each of them had to learn again to sew from scratch when they arrived at the company, learning to sew the 21 interleaved layers, kind of like a Russian doll of the Apollo spacesuit, to within 1/64 of an inch tolerance, all without the use of pins. The chief engineers in this process, contrasting sharply, of course, with those in the rest of the space race, were people like Leonard Shepard, the former TV repairman, and George Durney, who had no greater qualification than being a sewing repairman who was once in the Air Force. The suit itself was made of 21 different layers of fabric, each with a separate function, but none of them actually original none of them created anew for the space race. They all had an existing role here on Earth, and they were composited together into a single object where each one of the function of each one of these materials, like mylar or Teflon or latex, formed one particular part of the larger function of the spacesuit itself. It was an architecture that actually resembled, I argue, much more the body within the suit, or at least as much the body within the suit as it did the large systems architecture that surrounded it. The interface, of course, between these two architectures, the architecture of the military-industrial complex and the architecture of the human body itself, was not an easy one at all. And it was, in fact, on this kind of violent interface that the Playtex spacesuit operated as much a buffer between the body and the hostile environment of outer space as it did between the organizational logic of the body and the organizational logic of the military-industrial complex. And it was in between the pincers of these two different logic that Playtex found itself. One particularly poignant and sometimes hilarious example was the way in which Playtex had to fight to, instead of generating a new serial number for each part of the spacesuit as it was trimmed and modified like a couture garment to each astronaut's body, instead fought long and hard to be able to give the designations small, medium, and large, like clothing, to individual pieces of the suit, instead of these proliferating numbers which defined the rest of military-industrial reality. Because, of course, of the logic of the body, much in the same way that it had won the contract itself, not through its own advantages, but through rather its intimate understanding of the body's realities, Playtex won this battle as well. And every element of the suit was sized small, medium, and large, except for the urinary collection device, which, after an incident with the first astronaut fitted, was sized large, extra large, extra, extra large. To return to where we began, John F. Kennedy, the true lessons of adaptation and design in the space age seem less to do with form and system and more, I would argue, with fashion. To return to Christian Dior and the new look, to fashion is, of course, to make something out of something else, to literally fabricate a new look and its supporting architecture from, in the Apollo case, the foundation garments of bra and girdle. The danger of the present moment stands far from this feminine field. Yet, before we go into the landscape of the city, here a pre-Haussmann Paris juxtaposed with Dior's new look, I wish to tarry one last moment in the history of the space race to talk about something particularly architectural, that is to say, drawing and representation. As the craftswomen and engineers of Playtex sought to fit their own adaptive process into the confines of the military-industrial architecture that surrounded them in the NASA design process, the issue of representation became a particularly important one. Now, I haven't gone into this story very much, but Playtex was always almost losing this contract. And it was only their ability to actually produce the final object in a way that performed far better than any of these alternatives that kept them constantly in the running. But this one particular argument that Playtex had with NASA is particularly interesting, I think, to us in architects. And it goes to the issue of drawing and media. Now, of course, we all, as Robin Evans has pointed out better than anyone else, drawing in architecture has a particularly interesting role. That is to say, it does not, as drawing and painting does, perceive, rather that it attempts or tries to predict. That is to say, it institutes a reality that we hope will be translated into the world. drawing in the Apollo spacesuit production process ended up having a very different role than anywhere else in the systems architecture of the space race as a whole. Of course, everywhere else, particularly in the systems engineering process, everything had to be drawn in triplicate and endlessly enumerated and fabricated, and the drawing was the gospel. Unfortunately for NASA, the nature of the spacesuit production process as a craft couture assembly process meant that the process of prototyping, often by the seamstresses themselves, leapt out far in advance of what was represented or drawn. And the only final marker of what was designed was the suit as it was finally assembled. When NASA made it clear to Playtex that a full drawing set of the suit was a part of its contractual obligation under the systems engineering process, a set of drawings was in the end produced, but only after the fact. That is to say, after Armstrong and Aldrin had even gone to the moon, suits were taken apart like urban archaeology and then drawn as they were made, not drawn as things that were intended to be made. This is producing this completely useless but deeply beautiful set of ink on mylar drawings of the elaborate fabrication processes of the suit itself, in which fabric is treated here like a kind of steel section showing all the folds, et cetera, et cetera. And here, that is to say, I hope to bring us rather quickly now to the present day, but via one last detour into the 19th century. In his Passages from a Life of Philosopher of 1864, Charles Babbage recounts with incredulity, quote, "On several occasions I have been asked, 'Pray, Mr. Babbage, if you put into the machine wrong figures, will the right answers come out?' Well, the seeming certitude of data and a system-driven process will lead even the finest minds to assume the infallibility of computing. Those that Babbage were quoting were actually members of Parliament. The fact remains that the data-driven output of a computational system process is only as good as its input. The acronymic efficiency of 20th century computing has reduced this principle to a single mnemonic, GIGO, or garbage in, garbage out." Now, here's this very anxious point in the lecture where I attempt to pivot from a kind of critical and theoretical examination of things that happened a long time ago to a discussion of design work and things that are happening right now. And at the risk of making things over-obvious, it's been my intention, or my larger kind of obsession in looking at these historical hinges of the mid-century space race, to understand how they, far more than what we are introduced to these days as architectural history, let alone architectural theory, how they much more influence today's design practice than things which we are led to believe influence design project. That is to say, we are, as citizens of the 21st century, and especially as kind of quintessential citizens of the virtual space that was developed in the context of the space race, and its simulations, renderings, enumerations of coordinates and digital edges, et cetera, this space fundamentally is the space that we occupy as architects today. Often happily so, because of the enormous power of these tools to simulate, to project, to anticipate, and to describe reality. And yet, what I'm attempting to argue here for you tonight is grounded in this very empty terrain of the mid-century vacuum of outer space, grounded in the sky, if you will, should be, or could be, an understanding of these tools as, just like any media, something that was developed with a particular function in mind, and which has to be, if it's useful to us in the space of architecture, very deliberately misused. And so if we are to use it in our own way, we should understand its origins and understand how we're misusing it, but not necessarily for any kind of high-minded ethical or moral purpose, but rather because I believe the most interesting and essential creative possibilities for architects come through an understanding of tools and through an extension of the understanding of the tendencies, propensities, and hidden possibilities of those tools into day-to-day practice. So that sounds like a bit of a Jeremiad, so I'll just go straight into showing you things again. But with some sensitivity, I'm going to show you a bit of my own work and my own attempts to understand how this history and theory, as it were, of the systems technologies that we deploy as designers can throw up new kinds of possibilities, juxtaposed not, as it happens in the work I'm showing you, so much with the physical body of the astronaut, but juxtaposed with what was, in some sense, in this narrative, an equivalent figure, that is to say, the complex problem, as it was termed at the time, of the city. One student of the city, obsessed with information and what the systems of information could reveal, was an artist trained as an architect, Gordon Matta-Clark. Gordon Matta-Clark, between 1971 and 1973, spent years combing through microfiche in the real estate office of New York City to locate 15 vacant, abandoned sites, which he intended to work with, but which were left unfinished at the time of his, the work was left unfinished at the time of his death and exhibited later as this work, Fake Estates, Reality Properties. Today, when the tools used to digitally survey space in the context of SAGE have transformed into what we know as modern GIS and geospatial technology, this search for vacant leftover space exposes about 4,000 or 5,000 sites in New York, with the surface area approximating Central Park. And we should be very clear about what these sites are. They are very precisely something that I've been trying to talk about all evening in a very different context, which is to say they are the space, they are the precise space between the system of information that describes space in the city. That is to say, an imaginary utopia in which every space is used, every space has a purpose, every space is zoned. And these abandoned properties are precisely the kind of gasket between that virtual system definition of the architecture of the city and the real landscape of the city itself. So of course, in this regard, New York is not unique. If we look at other American cities, we find thousands of acres of leftover public land only made visible, mind you, by the actual deployment of a system which in its own perfect vision of the world, these sites do not exist. This kind of juxtaposition between the ability of a system like GIS to survey space and even find the spaces which the city's model idea of itself leaves out is the kind of activity that I think we should be preoccupied with as architects in this particular moment, or at least which provide particularly interesting opportunities to us as users of digital tools. These are, this is a survey of these 1,500 of these sites, which we've looked at in San Francisco. By we, I mean myself and several fantastic collaborators, not the royal we. And they are precisely what Matta-Clark termed, more eloquently than my explanation of a moment ago, spaces between places. That is to say, they are they are not out of sight, but they are certainly out of mind. And what's also very interesting about these spaces between places is they turned out to have again, deploying geospatial and techniques of simulation, of energy simulation, they turn out to have some very interesting qualities as well. Relative to social indicators, these leftover sites shown in black turn out to be coincide with pollution and carcinogen presence in the air in the city. They coincide with crime, reported crime, that is to say. They coincide with social indicators like this priority need index. And then thermodynamic simulations show that they coincide almost exactly with heat island effect and with impedances in the city's stormwater system, as well as the presence of heavy particulate matter. So again, these kinds of technologies are used to overlay and understand something which was previously invisible. In San Francisco, these combined sites have a surface area of 527 acres, half of Golden Gate Park, and the design project that I'm going to show you proposes a kind of surface renovation or land banking of these sites, which again, various techniques of simulation can help us understand to have enormous potential benefits to the city. So just to make it clear, I'm here again talking about myself, not necessarily to place myself in the same pantheon of all the other characters I'm talking about, but rather I think it's essential as an architect when you sound off about something to be very clear about whether and how it's actually influencing the own work that the work that you're trying to do. So with that brief aside, what the project does, and this project is about 2 years old and has been developed since these particular graphics as well, but what the project tries to do is take each of these 1,500 sites and then use parametric techniques to to construct a locally optimized landscape plan, which is designed fundamentally to, or which uses in its design process fundamentally the kind of thermodynamic indicators of the neighborhood, wind load on buildings, heat island effects, the stormwater technologies of stormwater retention, and then on each of these sites, these same parametric techniques first developed in Operation Breakthrough are used to develop the kind of basis of a new potential landscape. Working with my colleagues at the Berkeley Center for New Media, we've also developed at least several imaginings of how such a landscape could also be examined through a whole variety of networked-based interfaces. We've also looked at a potential funding model for these sites, in which a series of billion-dollar upgrades to a more conventional or traditional systems, like the $1.5 billion the PUC in San Francisco is proposing to spend on underground improvements to stormwater capacity, capacity that would not be necessary were there surface stormwater retention on these sites. We basically imagined how these funds could be split apart, and some portion of them could be directly given to each one of these many thousands of projects in proportion to the benefit that each project manages to institute in the fabric of the city. If we go back to the kind of social media simulation, we at least project that a process like this would only succeed if it aligned itself wherever it could with existing mechanisms of urban renovation, which are increasingly digitally mediated through projects like See, Click, Fix, etc. And the kind of network geometry that's created is one which doesn't seek to institute itself on the city, which again I think is a very important point of these larger lessons, but rather seeks to align itself wherever it can with the way in which the city actually operates. So of course the last part of this rendering takes you through this new happy place to a kind of larger network picture of what all these sites might do in the end. And we really have crunched the numbers here and sought to show that the projects could more than pay for themselves by the renovations that these, in the larger thermodynamic and energy performance of the city, would actually bring. So, if we go out to a larger scale of San Francisco, or even to a larger scale of multiple cities, of course, I've just shown you two things. One, a very long, perhaps long-winded kind of moralistic tale about technology networks and their deployment in design at mid-century, and then more briefly, a project of my own, which can probably hardly stand up to the implied criticism of a kind of totalizing project. And if we're to get out of that particular conundrum, we might go back very usefully or interestingly, again, to our 16th and almost last character, Matta-Clark. What many don't know about Matta-Clark is his view of design and design culture was formed at a very early age by his father, Robert Matta, who worked for 2 years in what at the time was termed the scientific studio of Le Corbusier, before rejecting the master's work as being suitable only for a, quote, for a non-existent, quote, creature that lived in perfect harmony with society and the environment. Matta-Clark traced his own interest in adaptive reuse to the observation that, quote, the availability of empty and neglected structures is a prime textual reminder of the ongoing fallacy of renewal through modernization. Half a century later, even as the ubiquity of geospatial data spurs tectonic shifts in our relationship to place, a range of forces, including the rift between architecture and planning that is one of the legacy of systems planning's urban failures, continue to militate against the systematic use of geospatial data, that is to say, information about place, in increasingly informationally driven architectural design. Given the prominence of computation in today's architectural culture and the growing trend to deploy digital and parametric tools at an urban scale, such an absence might seem actually quite curious. Perhaps here we should remind ourselves of the debt that today's data-driven practice owes to a quite different child of the 1970s, the autonomous, as they were called at the time, informal practices which signaled modernism's great retreat from the broad claims of social and system-based approaches. Forming a part of Matta-Clark's own education at Cornell from 1962 to 1968, the methodology was ultimately held by him in violent disregard, most famously when he destroyed the windows at Peter Eisenman's Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies with an air rifle. The violence of the act, at least for Matta-Clark himself, deliberately recalled the abandoned, shard-shrouded interiors of New York's great modernist housing projects, which were by the 1970s far more abandoned and blighted than they are today. Matta-Clark's interest in these abandoned realms returns us to his parallel cartographic research and to the prospect that a digital survey of urban space could drive not just an exercise in curiosity, but an instrumental deployment of systems-based design. Here we might turn to one of Matta-Clark's last unfinished work, which was the construction of a community center on an unused site on Manhattan's Lower East Side, for which he was preparing a proposal at the time of his death in 1978. Matta-Clark described the audience for his own community center proposal as precisely a, quote, network of community groups and individuals engaged in open space and rehab projects, sweat equity, community gardens, playlots, cultural events, alternative living structures, etc., adding that the delineated geometries of his proposal has, quote, brought these groups together. Matta-Clark's use of the word network should be very interesting to us in the context of this larger discussion. At the same time as he engaged his own design work more and more with the real fabric of cities versus virtual cuts and interventions in space, Matta-Clark became intrigued, it turns out, by what was at the time the state-of-the-art in system design digital tools. For a nascent project combining urban pneumatic architecture into what Matta-Clark termed network enclosures, this is actually the project for which the fake estates were the potential sites, the artist wrote shortly before his death to NASA and HUD-funded laboratories at Harvard, MIT, and UCLA, requesting the use of digital architectural mapping and visualization software, declaring them to be, quote, a vital part of my search to chart and reoccupy here, in the terrestrial sense, space. And here we come to our last two characters. Today, much of architectural culture borrows a network language, and particularly the language of complex, non-hierarchical natural systems. One of the earliest critics to connect such biological theories of emergence with urban design was, like Matta-Clark, a student of Manhattan. When, in the last chapter of her 1961 opus, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, itself called The Kind of Problem a City Is, urban activist Jane Jacobs sought to articulate a metaphor for urban planning as being distinct from the collection of file drawers, in her words, she abhorred, she turned to recent work at the Rockefeller Foundation, which had provided her with funding and an office in which to type her manuscript. Her office neighbor at the Institute was Warren Weaver. Dr. Warren Weaver was initially a cyberneticist and mathematician who had drawn more and more in the 60s to biological work at the same time as he was head of Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital in Manhattan. In an essay in the Rockefeller Foundation Annual Report in 1958, Weaver specifically identified new thinking in the natural sciences, describing what he was the first to term complexity. Quoting from Weaver's essay, Jacobs makes a case for the special affinity between urban landscapes and biological systems. Invoking the example of a single urban park, she submits that any attempt to isolate the variables, explicitly referring to system engineering's attempt to isolate variables and construct black boxes, Jacobs submits that any attempt to isolate the variables leading to the success or failure of even something as seemingly simple as an urban park is inherently dubious, for such variables are too numerous and too interconnected and ultimately too subtle. Now, the Rockefeller Foundation's subsequent funding played a catalytic role in today's interdisciplinary discussions of emergent form, and in particular the adoption of a biologically in particular, the generation of a biologically infected language, terms like morphogenetic, emergent, et cetera, which we find in many formalist architectural proposals. But the way in which these proposals attempt to deploy biological language, if you inspect just under the surface, turns out to be much more in the flavor of the systems engineering that we've also talked about tonight, which is to say, the notion of coding or even optimizing for a specific solution is so alien to the way biological systems actually turn out to work that to try and compare one to the other is almost logically absurd. New research in the natural sciences show, in fact, that far from occurring measurably, design processes in nature are too numerous, too interconnected, and, as Jacob said of urban variables, slipperier than an eel. Within this context, we might reflect on Adrian Forty's observation that the consistent application of natural and particularly biological language to architecture has served historically as, in fact, a persistent barrier to considering the manifold natural systems to which a building or city is actually connected. So in this context, what we actually have received in architectural culture today as a kind of biomimetic or ostensibly biomorphic language in which much, at least, of contemporary architecture of the last decade has constituted itself, turns out to be just below its surface. In fact, not the simulation of biological systems, but a direct, I would argue, translation from an earlier generation of systems engineering whose kind of masking in biological language helps obscure the fundamental antipathy between the systems approach and the natural, or shall we say complex, landscape of either the human body or that of the city as a whole. And so if I've done one thing here in this moderately rambling lecture, I hope I've illustrated the fact that an awareness or an understanding of history is not a luxury in architectural practice, but it's as fundamental a necessity as, say, functioning copy of Rhino. For what that history can teach us, particularly at this moment, is that the tools we have a certain DNA themselves, to borrow a biological metaphor. And that an awareness of this DNA allows us, in the language of biology, to discover not necessarily optimized solutions, but in the way that nature actually operates, rather fascinating adjacent possibilities to what we think might be possible. Because it is, of course, through these adjacent possibilities that evolution actually works. And here again, I think we come to the idea of fashioning. Because the word fashion, along with its no doubt actually incorrect connotations of superficiality or being on the moment, actually means, in the kind of classic MacGyverian sense, also this same idea of adjacent possibility. That is to say, making something out of something else, a use for which it was not necessarily originally intended, but can usefully, beautifully, fabulously, in the case of fashion, be now unexpectedly put. And so that idea of fashioning, deadly serious, but also, as all good design should be, potentially delightful, engaging, superficial, and world-changing at the same time, it's that sense of the possibility of design and of our current architectural moment that I would wish to leave you with. So thank you very much.